Welcome now officially to the SEA20 event focusing on how regulations can accelerate maritime decarbonization. And we're very happy to be back and able to arrange these SEA20 calls again. This will be a two-event series. Today we're discussing specifically regulations. A lot has happened over the summer. And then next week, a week from now, we will have another event that is focused on markets and finance and how markets can drive decarbonization in the maritime industry. So we certainly hope that you will all join the second call as well, so we can sort of discuss the two sides that of course should be working together so that we can get the best possible results and most impact. And my name is Partanen. I am here moderating the event on behalf of Nordic West Office, which functions as a coordinator for this SEA20 event. And we could first take a look at our agenda today a little bit closer so you can see what we're going to be up to. So here you can now see our agenda for today for this call. So we're very happy that we're going to have Jeremy Bentham and Håkan Agnevall first give a short takes on the issue to set up our conversation, and then we have a panel conversation. And of course, we're hoping that everyone in the audience will join in the chat. So to start with a few housekeeping rules, like I said earlier, let's keep our microphones muted while on the call, because this time we're having a lot of people join. You can type in your questions, comments in the chat, and if you have a question for a specific panelist, please mention that in the chat, and I will then as a moderator take questions and bring them to our panelists. Today, no raised hands, because we're not going to have the opportunity to have the audience ask questions with cameras on, simply because we have a packed agenda and we have quite a few people joining. But so first, I would like to invite Risto J. Penttilä, CEO of Nordic West Office and Chief Coordinator of the SEA20 initiative, to just say a few words to welcome you all again. Risto, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Anu, and welcome everyone. Wonderful to see all of you back together. The world is changing rapidly, but luckily we have a network of experts who can come together and advise each other in the form of this discussion and the following webinars as well. The SEA20 network really is very much needed at the moment. We need to be able to reflect with each other where the world is going. And thank you very much for showing up. We have a wonderful panel. I especially want to welcome Håkan Agnevall, CEO of Wärtsilä. I think this is, Håkan, your first time joining a SEA20 event. And I also want to very warmly welcome Jeremy Bentham from the Shell Scenarios team. Jeremy is probably the world's #1 expert on scenario thinking. So thank you very much, Håkan and Jeremy, for joining us. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and very welcome to the rest of the panel as well. Back to you, Anu.
Thank you, Risto. And briefly, just to add to the previous, my housekeeping rules comments, in the past, some of these SEA20 meetings have been very sort of intimate and a small group discussions. Today, we have a lot of people here, and we also have representatives of the media, which is wonderful. But just a reminder to everyone that in a sense, this is a public discussion today. So if you're used to the smaller group meetings today, consider this as a larger public discussion. Jeremy Bentham, welcome. Jeremy will share with us the work that Shell's legendary scenario team has lately done and show us 3 possible paths to the future. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Anu. And can I just confirm with a thumbs up that you can hear me okay?
Yes.
That's very good. First of all, I'm flattered and not deserving of those beautiful words that you said, both you and Risto, about myself. But I have had the privilege of leading this work as a member of the corporate strategy leadership team of Shell over the last 15 years. But we have 50-year history of this way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that is specifically tuned to helping us make wiser decisions. So think about the future and explore the future because we want to make better decisions now. And also, it opens our horizons to think more broadly than we would otherwise. And it gives us a discipline to learn from that. So I'm hoping that this will be, in some sense, an opportunity for you to hear just a brief introduction to some of our thinking, but also an opportunity to learn and apply that in your decisions. So if we move to the next slide, Anu, if we could.
I think we have Jenny running the slides. Jenny, I think it's not moving. No,
there we go. There we go. So these are energy transformation scenarios, but they are rooted in the reality of what we're experiencing today. And those realities are far beyond the energy system. Clearly, we're in a world with a global pandemic. We're in a world in which everybody, either individually or collectively, is seeking to work through a crisis of some sort. And what we have found is that as we've surveyed people around the world, there are really three things which are top of mind. Wealth, recovering the economy, security, and health, both individual health and public health. These are priorities for everybody. But naturally, different circumstances or different cultural settings will tend to make one of those priorities rise to the surface, be emphasized more than the others. And so our three scenarios start from one priority of wealth being the prominent priority generally around the world. And what are the consequences of that as you think about world developments and energy and this topic of decarbonisation that you're focused on in these sessions? What does it mean if security is rising in prominence? What does it mean if public health and other institutional matters are rising in prominence? So I'm going to talk very, very quickly through these areas and then talk about some of the lessons you can draw from those, if I could. So if we can move indeed to the next slide. So I'm going to just quickly introduce the wealth, the waves scenario. And this is a scenario in which, in decarbonisation terms, you see late decarbonisation in the global economy, but it's fast and disorderly. And how does that come about? Well, first of all, resilience in this world is understood in terms of economic strength. So the priority is repairing the economy. So economies are being opened quickly to try and regain activities and activity levels from the past. And not surprisingly, this leads to waves of infection and then lockdowns again. And so you can see how these waves are beginning to form. But in general, the economy is opened up. And so you do get this surge in productivity. You see already how many economies have been opening up and are beginning to regain strength again. But you can't do or build or operate, move anything without energy, as you know. So this leads to a resurgence in energy use and in greenhouse gas and related emissions. Because there's been this narrow focus on economic activity, the underlying stresses in society have not been addressed, particularly. They've been somewhat neglected, so that growing inequalities we've seen in the world, not only between different parts of the world, but in individual economies, those inequalities continue to grow. We all have seen instances in different countries of how care workers and health workers and logistic workers have been applauded in the course of the pandemic, but these people still find themselves in low-paid, underappreciated work. And this leads to social tensions. It leads to eventually industrial unrest later in this decade. At the same time, the climate-related events that people have already seen are continuing. And the fact that there hasn't been really strong attention to these in the past decade begins to also become a focus of social unrest. And so as these issues intensify, you get backlashes. You get economic backlashes, but you also get backlashes in the climate and energy and emissions related fields. So you get imposed mandates around the world, waves and waves of them. So you get this very fast decarbonisation forced by that, but it's disorderly, and there are stranded assets as a result of that. Because it's late, we don't achieve the Paris ambition of 1.5 degrees C maximum, but you see this rising to about 2.3 degrees C, which we've done this work with MIT about the climate impact of that. So if we move to the next slide. In this world, security has risen to the top, and resilience is seen as self-sufficiency, autonomy, and you get this islands mentality, this growing nationalism. You already see in the world how there are frictions in collaboration and trade. You see frictions in the way that some countries have been able to access vaccines quickly and some haven't. So in a world, in this geopolitical type of situation, economies stagnate to an extent. You've got lower trade. Global cooperation is lower. Climate action slows. Cleaner technology makes progress because already much of it is affordable, but the new breakthroughs aren't there. You're not getting the alignments for bringing it into new areas beyond the cleaner electricity you see now. So this is a slow decarbonisation with temperatures rising to 2.5 degrees by the end of the century and still continuing. And go to the next slide. So let me take you into the third world, in which health first, in a broader sense, is seen as the priority. The path towards resilience in this kind of world is seen in repairing the institutions, either the public health institutions, but also the societal institutions that have been exposed as being weak, but also learning from each other and learning from the past. This is where people have learnt that good practice in medical management in one area can be applied in other areas. So there is medical advance. People have learned from the way that alignments and collaboration scientifically have enabled vaccines to be developed at an unprecedented pace and be deployed at an unprecedented pace as well. So this recognition in the value of alignments. Some of these come about deliberately, but some of them simply because people are facing the same forces and their actions begin to align. So you begin in this to see people recognizing how investment in cleaner technologies actually brings more jobs as well as having an environmentally positive impact. So you begin to see deep structural changes in lowering emissions driven by domestic economic reasons as well as international agreements as well. And so this is a world, Sky 1.5, in which the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels being attained by the end of the century is in fact achieved. So if I move to the next slide, just to round out from this, and from an energy point of view, all of these outlooks have similar features. The difference is how fast things happen and in how a disruptive way that they happen. But in all outlooks, efficiency is important, electrification is important, molecular fuels remain important for things like freight and shipping and aviation. And hence, whilst oil and gas play a role, these are steadily replaced by decarbonised versions of that, biofuels, hydrogen, ammonia, and emissions removal and reforestation play an important role. So coming to my final slide, just to pull together the lessons from this, really we can learn from history. I don't know whether you can bring up what's in the hexagons there. The action accelerators are really important because our work illuminates the need to accelerate action if you're going to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. The three main accelerators are those alignments that are either deliberately fostered or occur under the same pressures. Smart policies, policies that help promote the alignments, but also help move those parts of technology areas that are already affordable, like solar and wind for electricity, more broadly in the economy through carbon pricing, but also provide incentives for those areas that are not yet affordable, such as the biofuels, such as the hydrogen and ammonia and other areas as well. And finally, you see the lesson of the importance of pioneer leaders. The way, for example, in California back in the early 2000s, pioneer leaders in not only government, but in technology companies stepped forward to bring certain technologies and approaches such as the carbon trading forward into the Californian economy. So we can learn these lessons from history, but also from past crises too, because we have seen how crises galvanize action. So 30, 40 years ago, many of the things we take for granted now, whether those are electric vehicles or whether those are wind power or solar power, were not affordable. They were not practical. But crises such as the oil price crises in the 70s, such as the Asian financial crisis, such as the Fukushima crisis, all these areas have spurred different actors and different governments to take action and to make these tacit alignments. So if crises can galvanize action, we're in a crisis now. Can you, in your sector, build the momentum to transform the sector by smart policies, smart alignments, and the stepping forward as pioneer leaders? And I leave you with that challenge and look forward to the rest of your meeting.
Thank you, Jeremy. Exactly the challenge that we're discussing here. Thank you for your presentation. Just to focus before we move on, what do you think when you think of these scenarios? And of course, we want to move towards Sky 1.5. That is the best case scenario. And we're going to discuss regulations today, and then we're going to discuss markets. And you call for alignment. What would be your message to our discussants today in terms of what do we need to think about in regulations and markets to get to that scenario?
I think there are two things. I think one would be that this is not a matter of altruism. We know that there's a common good issue here, but also we know that either our businesses become more sustainable, our societies become more sustainable, our domestic economies in different parts of the world become more sustainable and more competitive if one can take a lead in accelerating and deploying cleaner technologies. So this is an and type of benefit, are not just a trade-off as it's often been portrayed. And secondly, the fact that pioneer leaders, either leading organizations or leading governments, are really, really important. I didn't have time to give examples, but the way that a simple thing such as I mentioned in California, the way that leaders brought around a particular framework there, and then technology leaders like Elon Musk with Tesla saw an opportunity to access a particular sector of consumer leaders to begin to generate enough commercial funding to build what is now a major valuable business. And so that combination of pioneer leaders and getting away from a trade-off mentality and seeing that this is actually not only a threat but an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining us. And now we'll move from these shell scenarios to maritime industry. And I'd like to give the floor to Håkan Agnevall, President and CEO of Wärtsilä Corporation. And Wärtsilä, of course, as a company, is a technology expert that offers complete life cycle solutions for both the marine and energy markets. And so they are in a really unique position to discuss decarbonizing the maritime industry from well to wake, if you will. Welcome, Håkan Agnevall. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's a privilege to be here. And first of all, listen to Jeremy, but also I know we have a great panel coming up, and thanks everybody for joining. Coming back, I think these are times for change. I think we all see the serious situation that is in front of us, and we really need to address the decarbonisation journey. As Wärtsilä, we are a strong believer. We are not the biggest company in the world, but we do believe that with the products and services that we are providing, that we can actually contribute to this change. And in our kind of strategic direction that we have set, I mean, we basically set decarbonisation as a target, and focusing all our efforts on how we can apply new technology to decarbonize with different type of fuels, both the marine sector and also the energy sector, where we're providing balancing power. But I think the important thing here is that, you know, we are one player in an ecosystem. And I think we all represent different parts of that ecosystem, and it needs to come together clearly, because we don't only need the latest technology, we need fuels, we need infrastructure, we need regulations. And I think we all recognize that the regulations really need to be put in place to facilitate and catalyze the change that needs to come. Because at the end of the day, we know that the green fuels, originally at least, will be more expensive than the current fossil fuel. And the change still needs to happen. And the regulations needs to help us to level out the playing field, at least initially, so to say, to kickstart this movement. I know that there are entrepreneurs and pioneers out there that is starting the development already now, even though the regulatory framework is not perfect and it's not there, quite frankly, to a significant degree. So we will always find pioneers leading the way, but to make the major transition, I think we need a regulatory context that needs that helps us coming together in the ecosystem. And I must say that I see a lot of interesting initiatives, different companies in the industry cooperating in different ways around new technology. So there is there is a lot of interest, a lot of engagement, a lot of money put in, and will and good talent put in, but regulations needs to follow suit, so to say, to make the major shift that we need for a sustainable future. We also need to recognize that green is not black or white. I mean, there are no simple solutions. There is no one silver bullet solution. I think we need to recognize as we move forward that there will be different solutions that will be feasible or optimal for certain applications, for certain geographies, quite frankly. And I think the ecosystem, many players in the ecosystem recognize this. I think we also have a role to make sure that political system and the general public understands this, because there is always a tendency in crisis to want to have simple solutions. And I think many of us recognize there will be no simple solutions. There will be many good solutions, but not one silver bullet. And this is also an era that makes the shift a bit complex, because what applies in a certain context you cannot automatically replicate in another. And that makes it even more important that we have thought leaders that can talk and give balanced views on the pros and cons of all solutions, so to say. And there are thought leaders evolving. We aspire to be one of them, but there is a journey to be made, because as I said, there will be different technologies, and I think we will all learn how to work with them going forward. So from my side, I see a lot of opportunities. I see a lot of interest, money to start to flow, but a clear need for also for the regulatory context to evolve, and in a quite rapid pace if we want to trigger a rapid change. So from my side to the panelists, and thank you for being on the panel, but also
I think we briefly lost Håkan there. At least I lost him. Okay. Okay, he's waiting in the lobby. Let's see. Håkan, do we have you back? I think we lost you momentarily.
Yeah, no, that I was just. Okay. So, no, as I said to the panelists, and just to send a question to the panelists, I think that the one thing to reflect for each participant, what are we going to contribute concretely with in the next 12 to 24 months to make this change happen? Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Håkan Agnevall. And now on to our fantastic panel. I will introduce our panelists a little bit more in detail as we invite them to speak, but just to set the general tone for our regulations discussion, of course, we're all aware that there is great urgency, that just this past summer, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned us that unless there's immediate, rapid and large-scale action and reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we're not going to meet our targets, and limiting warming to close to 1.5 Celsius or even 2 Celsius will be beyond reach. So we really need to act now. And over the course of the summer, of course, there were regulatory movements in the maritime industry. So the International Maritime Organization came out with new suggestions for mechanisms for ships to measure their energy efficiency and so on. And the EU came out with Fit for 55, the climate plan that also, for example, proposes that marine transport is to be included for the first time in the Union's carbon cap and trade system. So these are the changes that have come lately. And now let's discuss, what do they mean? Will they have an impact? And where should we go next? I would like to start asking Sveinung Oftedal a question. Sveinung, you are the chair of the intersessional working group for greenhouse gases from ships that makes direct recommendations for the IMO's, the Marine Environment Protection Committee. So you have been very directly and deeply involved in all these IMO negotiations over new measures. What would you say are the most important aspects of these new regulations and mechanisms that have come out?
Thank you very much, and also for inviting me to take part of this very important event. Let me start by saying that by adopting the GHG strategy in 2018, IMO did something which in the historical terms of the organization is quite unique. We defined a pathway for phasing out GHG emissions in this century, and with clear ambitions to achieve with target dates. After that, and also through the pandemic period, we have then negotiated then specific requirements to be included in the MARPOL Convention. What we have done now in this first phase have been to adopt new energy efficiency requirements for new ships, the EEDI, to strengthen that. But we have also, just prior to the summer, agreed to energy efficiency requirements for existing ships with the technical efficiency and the operational efficiency. And of course, this has been extensively discussed among member states, but also within industry. What we can see now, if the development in the trade will go as expected, actually these requirements will then reduce emissions. So I think we are in the energy efficiency requirements achieved by the IMO. The industry have both the technical adjustments to be made on existing ships, but also need to look through their operations in a totally new way. So this has been agreed, but the IMO don't stop. We will go through negotiations this autumn as well on the next package, so we will see what will come.
So just to follow up, in general discussion, the new IMO measures have been often considered to be quite weak. People think that they're not ambitious enough. What do you think of that?
Well, okay, I think what is ambitious enough when it comes to the climate change challenge? I think both within the Paris Agreement and in the IMO context, I think we haven't responded properly to the challenge as such. However, what we have now seen at the IMO, we stick to our agreed ambition. We have said what to achieve in 2030. We stick to that. We have established a target for 2050. And there is a clear intention to meet that. But also, do not forget that we will negotiate the strategy as such, meaning, I guess, that the ambitions as such will be renegotiated towards the revised strategy in 2033. So I think in relation to a global transition, a global requirement regime, we are on the edge to do something new, which is quite remarkable in the history of the IMO, because it's so related to the energy transition as such. And so shipping is not an isolated island itself. It's clearly related to the energy transition as such.
Okay, we have with us Timothy Noel. Timothy, you work at the European Commission's Directorate General for Climate Action, which leads the European Commission's efforts to fight climate change at the EU and international level. And you work in the unit that is in charge of international carbon market in aviation and maritime. So, as mentioned before, the EU published its Fit for 55 plan this past summer, and it includes quite ambitious targets and plans for the maritime industry. And in the public conversation, again, many have said that the EU is much more ambitious than the IMO. But what do you consider to be the most consequential aspects of this plan, the EU plan for the maritime industry?
Many thanks, Anu, for your question, and let me take that opportunity to also thank the organizer of this important SEA20 event. Yes, the Commission has proposed on 14th of July a number of measures to address shipping emissions. as part of a broader package, the Fit for 55 package that aims to implement the European Green Deal. We propose these measures on maritime because we believe the sector needs really to contribute to the EU climate objective of the Union, with the ambition, as you know, to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. And also to contribute to the objective of the Paris Agreement, which requires all developed countries to take the lead by undertaking an economy-wide emissions reduction target. And in practice, as it has been said before, there is no silver bullet. And this is the reason why we are proposing a basket of measures to address shipping emissions, and this includes the extension of the emission trading system to maritime transport emission, as well as the launch of a specific initiative to boost and support the deployment of sustainable alternative fuel. And in addition to that, we propose to review existing directives dealing with energy taxation, but also dealing with infrastructures in relation to alternative fuels or renewable energy. And that's what we need. We need basically different fronts, different tools to address the different barriers that hinder basically the deployment of low carbon solutions in the market. So it's really a package on shipping, which is part of a broader package to achieve our goal in terms of the European Green Deal.
And what would you say in terms of level ambition? How do you consider the IMO and the EU efforts to align?
We want the EU to be a front runner. We believe that we need to lead by example. We believe that we need to act now quickly in order to achieve our 2050 targets. And in order to achieve our 2050 targets, we need already to progress quickly as from 2030, because our goal is to reduce emissions by at least 55% in 2030 compared to 1990 level. If we want to be there in 9 years' time, we really need to act fast and act now. And we don't think that we should be opposing, what's being done at the international level with the IMO. And we very much welcome the progress and the discussions that are happening at IMO with basically what is being done at the EU. I think we need both. We need both because the challenge is very important, very challenging, and so we all need to act at the appropriate pace and at the appropriate level.
David Cummins, you work at Blue Sky Maritime, which is a relatively new coalition, and your goal is to help North American, so Canadian and American maritime industry to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And your members include companies like Caterpillar and Shell, and ports like Port of Houston and Vancouver. From what I understand, the North American maritime industry is governed by a very different set of regulations by the states, by the ports, and so on. What is the significance of these international regulations to the North American maritime industry, especially the IMO and the EU efforts that we're talking about now?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here as well. I would say that the goals of the regulations, when you look at things in a domestic way or a regional way, as we're doing, are very similar to like what Europe is doing or IMO. But the solutions and the hurdles to achieving those goals are very different in many respects, or certainly can be. The international regulations tend to focus, as they should be doing, on large ocean-going vessels that call in many different ports, including some very important ones in North America. But domestic regulations take into consideration many more different types of vessels, and they're often very interlinked with communities and ports and other types of sectors, trucking and when you're dealing with the inland coastal waterways as well as the major ports. And they have unique challenges. There are social challenges. There's a lot of different challenges. So if you think in some regulatory areas, such as transparency and tracking emissions, those same goals need to overlap at the ports where the international shipping meets the domestic shipping. But you wouldn't measure emissions on a commercial fishing vessel or tug and barge operations or in the same ways, or offshore supply vessels that you would measure for the large ocean-going vessels.
It's my understanding also that the maritime industry in North America is often quite critical of the IMO regulations. Can you give a little background on that?
Yeah, I would say you may be better to use the term "not applicable" is a lot of the thinking.
Okay.
I would also say that the U.S. is a country that has a tendency to go its own way on environmental regulations and other things as well. And sometimes this can be damaging if it cuts the U.S. off from global supply chains and raises costs and products that have to be certified and learn how to treat safely. And you can't really do that in a unique U.S.-only market because it's not deep enough to amortize the cost of doing all that. But again, what I would say is there needs to be compatibility, I think, between IMO regulations. You certainly don't want to come up with regulations in the US that you can't then roll up into what does that mean on the global stage, because we are all.
Okay, I think maybe we lost David there for a moment. The Teams is a little slow today. Okay, I'm sure we'll get him back in a moment. Meanwhile, I would like to invite Hu Kuyi, Chief Designer, Technical Designer at Jiangnan Shipyard in China, to join us for the panel. So you work in China. What is your perspective on the new IMO and EU initiatives and international regulation? What is the impact that they have on your shipyard's operations?
So I think for these new regulations, the shipyard side is mainly we will follow this new tendency of the decarbonization. So in our shipyard, comparing the 10 years before, we are focused on the green ship. That means we are focused on the reduce the SOx and NOx, and we're doing a lot of the improvement of the ship itself, like we use a CFD to optimization the speed performance. We also use the new type of engine to reduce the SOx and NOx. Now we are more considering reduce to the CO2. So comparing the from 10 years before, so we are now considering more alternative fuel, because if you see now ship design, like whole form optimization and power already close the ceiling. So no further room to improve. So we have to consider alternative fuel, some like LNG, LPG, and also ethylene as a fuel. This kind of the gas fuel will significantly improve the emission, and of course it can also reduce the CO2. I think this is some bridge to filling the gap of the decarbonization, because we have to considering the feasibility of also the infrastructure for bunkering supply. So for some ship owner, still pays more attention on the extra cost to do the use LNG as fuel, the gas as fuel. Actually, really is a cost. Even for very boom now, the container ship still have some more than half ship owners still considering use a scrubber instead of the gas fuel directly. Further, of course, we are now studying for the zero carbon fuel like ammonia. So, but still we have to waiting the engine make to can provide the such ammonia fuel engine ready. So for also for the supply infrastructure still needed to establish.
Well, that leads me to Andrea Morgante. Andrea, you are Vice President of Strategy at Wärtsilä Marine Power, and Wärtsilä Marine Power provides technology for various types of ships, and in particular for their engines. And so What level of ambition is the technology ready to meet today? If we think about these regulations that are being set up, is the technology there even yet to reach these targets or respond to what the regulators want?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for the question as well. I mean, I think it's important to clarify that the technology to drastically reduce emissions already exists today. Discussing with some owners a couple of weeks back, I think they summarized it very clearly. The problem is not downstream, the problem is upstream. It's in fuel availability rather than in the technology availability. One could actually say that we've been preparing for this for over decades. I mean, in 2003, we brought the first engines running on methane, biomethane, synthetic methane. In 2015, we did the first conversion of methanol. This year, just in July, we announced we reached already a significant milestones in testing ammonia and hydrogen. Ammonia was 70% blend, and in ranges that are load ranges are typical for a vessel operation. And we're going to have a concept ready by 2023 for engine concept for ammonia and for hydrogen by 2025. So I think the challenge here is not on the technology side, and the important thing here is to understand that it is possible to invest in fuel-ready vessels already today. From this perspective, I think that the Fit for 55 proposal, for instance, compared maybe to the IMO, has gone farther and hit, they chase the CO2 and with a number of different policies across the industry. I think that's also very important, not just maritime. And there is one that I think is relevant for maritime, particularly the one on fuel, EU fuel, I think it's called. And they allow things like pooling of vessels, so you can actually make investments, and if you exceed what is required by regulation, you pass on that kind of excess to cover the rest of the vessels on your fuel on your fleet. This helps clarifying the investment path for owners. Another thing that they did is to take steps or provide steps that will bring clarity in the cost of carbon pricing. That's something that IMO has been discussed for a long time. Hopefully, now the discussion will move faster. All of this will help move forward. But again, it is important to understand technology-wise, we are ready to go already now, and you can actually make investments today that will secure that your asset will be relevant going forward.
So what do you think, if technology is there, like you say, what are the biggest obstacles that it's not happening yet, or just happening slowly?
Well, I mean, I've sort of hinted to that already. Personally, I think one of the biggest, there are two obstacles. On one end, you have fragmented regulation. I mean, I think everybody in the industry, this is an international industry, everybody would like to see an international regulation come into play. But it is also clear that what has been achieved at IMO level does not satisfy maybe equally different regions in the world. And then you get this kind of policies at local level that introduce slightly different limits. I mean, they are aiming at the same thing, but they're providing different measures. What this could lead is to a more complicated, more fragmented kind of scenario in terms of regulation. So clarity on regulation is one thing we need. The other thing is securing the supply of the fuel. And of course, this will not happen overnight. It's also important we understand we need to work with other industries. There are industries that are today using what we call fuel, for them is a chemical in a process. Hydrogen used in fertilizers or treatment of refinement of fuels. Methanol is used for production of things like glues and adhesives and stuff like that. So and there's actually several 100 million tons of these chemicals already needed. So it's by combining forces with other industries, you can create the kind of, the offtake guarantee that de-risk investments in production of new fuels. And these are the two main things, personally, I believe need to be achieved to move forward.
And our final panelist, Jan Otterdekaat, you are Director at Global Sustainability Center at American Bureau of Shipping. And of course, American Bureau of Shipping provides global classification services to the marine industry. So what are your thoughts on the new regulations from classification perspective?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, good question. And by the way, I have different hats, ABS hat, but also the hat for the Maersk Billy Muller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. But looking at it from the class perspective, yeah, and then of course Ajax wants to play very much a advisory role in the IMO to ensure that the regulations that are being discussed make sense also from the verification perspective. That's of course what class societies would do typically. When it comes to the, let's say, objectives, yeah, there's a lot of discussion right now on some of the details. How do we verify, the EEXI, the CII targets, and the, let's say, implementation of those measures, as Sveinung Oftedal referred to, is very important. I think also, though, by the way, besides those objectives from an IMO perspective, seems to me it's also important that we have that we agree on a set of absolute CO2 reduction measures or targets, and not only CO2 but also greenhouse gas emissions, because in the end the goal from the IMO, the strategy was to by 2050 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in line with other agreements in the UN. But I think it would be good if we could also set those targets back to say how does it refer to 2030? Because now we have the CII targets, we reduce say by 11% by 2027 or so. Maybe we'll continue to 2030, but what does it mean in terms of the absolute reductions? Because that's in the end what we are after, really, when it comes to reducing our impact on global warming. So I think also again from the verification perspective, besides looking at those CO2 and greenhouse gas targets, we also need to look at some other, let's say, aspects to, when we talk about accelerating the decarbonisation of the shipping industry, and the regulations do play an important role, both, let's say, at the regional and international level. But I think one important one is the well-to-wake perspective. So how can we encourage first movers, especially, to invest, and they are, potentially invest big investments. We talk about the technology is there, what's in the making for the shipboard use, but we still, of course, need to look at the infrastructure on the ports and so on, the bunkering. Nevertheless, when now a ship owner invests, say, in a methanol or a green methanol or a green ammonia type of design, you don't get any credit from the regulatory perspective, because at the moment the regulation is still the tank to wake, let's say, only per ship, rather than looking at the complete well to wake or on a fleet-wide basis either. So anyway, that's I think an area where, and also from the we can let's say advise, or at least contribute in terms of how can that be determined and how can we verify that part. MBMs have been measured, have been mentioned in terms of the levies, yes. And I think maybe also here it would be interesting to look at what the impact is going to be from the EU, both the ETS scheme, but also the Fuel EU Maritime, to really hopefully maybe accelerate the process at IMO, or at least provide, let's say, guidance at IMO. And by the way, the other initiative, whether it was started by industry at the IMO, is this International Maritime R&D Board and Fund. Hasn't been, let's say, fully accepted at this stage, but it's still on the agenda. It could also work as, let's say, a springboard, if you like, to the more serious MBMs. So I think, yeah, with this, and we have, of course, and then lastly, the technology side, where we also in SABS are quite closely involved with this. It's not only the fuels and the availability, but also what can we further do to improve the energy efficiency on the ships. And for example, how can we help ships further, let's say, decrease their energy consumption? For example, it could be wind assistance, it could be air lubrication, anything, those new technologies, because as we move towards the new fuels, whether it's green ammonia or whatever, they will not be cheap. So then it still makes sense to have an as energy efficient ship as possible. And I would like to conclude with that, and I hope from us also from the class side we can contribute to those kind of ships. Thanks.
Thank you. And at this point, I could remind our panelists that if you want to react to something somebody else has said, you have the permission to raise hand, and you can, if you have your camera on, you can do it just with your hand, and I will give you your turn to speak. But of course, you'll get your turn to speak otherwise as well. And to our audience, I see that a few people have already posted questions in the chat. Thank you. That's wonderful. We will bring them to our panelists. But you can, of course, also comment and keep those questions coming, and we will bring them to be part of this conversation. To discuss some of the very practical aspects that we could expect to see from the current regulatory developments, Timothy, now, what does it mean in practice to include shipping in carbon pricing? What is going to happen?
That's a good question. So what we propose is to extend the scope of the EU's emission trading system to maritime transport CO2 emissions. So it goes beyond carbon pricing, if you want. And I think it's important to understand basically how the EU ETS, ETS stands for emission trading system, works in practice. In practice, what we do is that we every year we define a cap, that is to say the maximum amount of emissions that can be emitted by companies in a given year. And based on this cap, which we reduce every year to ensure that we basically reduce emission, we issue a fixed number of ETS allowances in the market. And then we ask each companies to basically surrender enough allowances to cover all their annual emissions. So that's basically how it works. Then you might wonder how companies can allowances. So they can buy allowances on the market through intermediaries, financial intermediaries, or they can eventually receive some of them free in case they are facing a risk of carbon leakage. And so what happens is that you have a market where you have companies that basically are in the demand allowances, and then you have allowances that are proposed to the market. So you have an offer and demand, and then you have a carbon price. And the carbon price is around 60 euro per ton CO2 at the moment. And in case companies do not surrender enough allowances, then they are facing a fine of around 110 euros for every ton of CO2 not covered by an allowance. This system has been working since 2005 in the EU. It currently covers around 40% of all EU emissions, so it's not a small experience. It's really something that has been working well. It has become one of our key policies to combat climate change. What does it bring in terms of advantages? A key advantage is that it caps emissions. It means that it's a policy tool that we can use in order to control the actual quantity of emissions that will be emitted by of the system, because it allows companies to basically invest where the mitigation actions are the cheapest, so in the most cost-effective way. Another important aspect is that it creates a long-term price signal, and in that respect, it changed the business case of companies, and it will incentivize companies to invest in new technologies. And last but not least, basically it requires companies to buy allowances. This generates revenues. Revenues are used basically to support innovation through different mechanisms like the Innovation Fund, or directly to support the implementation of mitigation measures. So that's really how it works currently for the power sectors, for aviation, and for industry. And that's how it's going to work as well for maritime. So what we propose is not to reinvent the system, but really to build on what already exists and works at EU level. And we will do that by also using the currently running rules to monitor, report and verify CO2 emissions that are already running since 2018. Our plan is to include in the system around 2/3 of the EU-related maritime transport emission. We propose to include all the CO2 emissions that are linked to intra-EU voyages, so basically voyages from one port in the EU to another port in the EU, and half of the emissions from extra-EU voyages, meaning voyages that includes a port located in the EU and a port located in a third countries. So that's basically how it's going to work in terms of the specific ship that will fall under the system. We are small ships, one below 5,000 GT, mainly for proportionality reason, and we also propose a phase-in system. So we propose to start the system as from 2023 and to gradually ask the company to surrender enough allowances up to 100% in 2026. So yeah, I think it's very important to really understand how does it work and to understand that it goes beyond just the carbon pricing mechanism. And I hope that I've been sufficiently clear in my explanation about how does it work in practice.
We have Sveinung raising a hand, so I will give you a turn to speak, and then I think I'll take a few of the questions that the audience has sent in, but go for it, Sveinung.
Thank you. I just want to comment about, let's say, two issues. One, when it comes to the policy development at the IMO, I think it is very important to note the following. It is policy negotiations, mean it's a member state agreement. So in this context, I think it is very important to know that it's not only about, let's say, technical issue, it's also about especially the phase we are going into now, where this the new type of requirements will need to take into account the fuel transition issue, the energy transition. Then it will also be about, let's say, a global fair transition, developing countries, and then the various proposals and mechanisms will need to be seen in that context. But my observation is that IMO member states, they have an intent to stick to their target, meaning that we don't know what we'll get in the future, but clearly there is a plan to stick to the target, meaning when it comes to what to achieve in relation to emission reductions. The other comment I would have is relating to, let's say, the shipping industry, meaning all within the maritime market. The time when we could only look to the IMO in order to, let's say, judge how to act is over. Now I think you need to look into what will the market expect, what will the IMO do, what will the EU do, what kind of national initiatives will take place when it comes to respond to the climate change and what to require. Meaning both when it comes to the positive side, meaning incentives and what can you gain, and also when it comes to what kind of punishment, the whip. So being now in the industry, I think that it's far more complex than it used to be. Okay, I'll stop there.
I will continue with a question from the audience that I think you can possibly answer, which already relates to the future. So where are we going from now? So we're going to have in the beginning of November, the COP26 meeting, the UN Climate Change Conference, and then we're going to have the IMO Marine Environment Protection Committee session coming also in November. And so we have a question of the audience, what can we expect to see there coming from the IMO? What do you think, Svein?
Well, when it comes to the MEPC meeting, I think that will be about mainly two things. One is to define the starting point to start on negotiating the revised strategy. Do not forget that the strategy defines ambitions and what, let's say, how to achieve the ambitions, meaning from a policy framework. So that will be an important point. The other things which will be on the table will be more or less, let's say, where are we when it comes to proposals and how to define the further process. But when it comes to what you can expect as an outcome is to define the starting point to revise the revision, the strategy, and then the other topics. I think you will just have a kind of bus stop. Here we are, and this is the plan for further work. There will be no new measures to be agreed upon, I would guess, but rather it's a kind of bus stop where we are. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have several questions that relate to the new fuels, to green methanol and so on. So I will direct this one to Andrea, but if anybody else wants to in the panel comment on these, please feel free, because I think these questions were not directed to any specific panelists. So everybody here refers frequently to green methanol and green ammonia, which are not available today and have large uncertainties in terms of potential growth. What about biomethane, which is already produced at 18 million tons per year?
I think we love biomethane. I mean, what's not to love about biomethane? I mean, today we already have customers that are actually selecting LNG as a main source of energy and mixing it in the tank directly with biomethane, so they can offer a service, a differentiated service to their customers, referring, for instance, to container ships. The beauty of biomethane is that you can mix it, drop in the tank. So essentially, you can reduce the carbon footprint, overall carbon footprint, to the extent you think it's relevant, and I would say to the extent also you can secure the supply. So absolutely, I think that is well, that's actually why we say that we can start the decarbonization already now, and it's also compatible with the ambitions, certainly with the IMO ambitions, but also with the EU ambitions. If there is one thing, there would need to be an increase in the supply of that fuel.
And a related question about ammonia. Do you view the toxicity concerns with ammonia to be a significant hurdle to adoption as an alternative fuel?
I think that's there is already experience in other industries on how to handle ammonia, and every time we introduce a new fuel, we need to work closely with classification societies to determine what kind of safety measures have to be deployed. But I also believe that the experience we have built on, for instance, in using natural gas, for instance, double wall pipes and so on. A lot of that experience can be brought forward in the adoption of ammonia. The challenges are different, but the experience we have, I mean, the discussion we're having also with classification society shows that this is possible.
I see Jan-Otto has raised a hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. No, definitely we are actually right now engaged in many projects dealing with ammonia as a fuel and also other types of fuel. But when it comes to ammonia, certainly, of course, the toxicity is a key issue. It's dangerous when inhaled and at very, let's say, for a given concentration. It is also harmful to the environment in case there is, say, a leakage into the ocean environment. However, there is indeed a lot of experience with ammonia for fertilizers, as already applied by Andrea, but also, ammonia has been used as a cargo on board ships for many, many decades. Plus, there's a significant body of experience with ammonia as a refrigerant on, for example, fishing vessels. The old reefer ships possibly also were using ammonia as a refrigerant. So, yes, there's a lot of experience. So it's a matter of saying, can we pool that experience? And now when we do, the ammonia fueled ships evaluations from the class side, we go through the risk assessment process to ensure and, say what the hazards and the HAZOPs. So looking at all, let's say, technical operational issues, identify where are key risks and how do you mitigate those risks to come at a level that is acceptable in terms of its safety. So we don't see it as a key you say, hurdle. It's just a matter of identifying all the risks, and then it should be technically possible. But by the way, and I think and there's another unknown element here, let's say, where we need to build up experience, is more this bunkering of ammonia, where there's no international body that's responsible for bunkering regulations. But here we have, for example, other organizations that provide guidelines when it comes to bunkering. So here it will be good to have ammonia bunkering guidelines in place, and also the IMO would take on board ammonia as a fuel explicitly, because right now we only have LNG, methanol as a fuel covered under the IGF code. When any other formula, let's say, fuel will be dealt with, through the risk analysis process. But I think it would be good to also put ammonia on the IMO agenda as a fuel explicitly. Thanks.
We have Timothy, and then we have David from Blue Sky Maritime back with us. So Timothy, go ahead, comment, and then I'll give the floor to David.
Yeah, just to make a quick comment and make the link with the regulatory aspect. As part of the basket of measures that we are proposing on maritime, like I've said before, there is a specific initiative to support the deployment of alternative fuel and to try to find a way to solve these chicken and egg questions about how to support and how to accelerate their deployment. These specific initiatives aims to secure basically the demand for this type of fuel in the short to the long term. The idea is to set a specific greenhouse gas intensity limit of the energy used on board that is being calculated on a well-to-wake basis, that takes into account the upstream but also the downstream emissions. And we believe that that's important, basically, to differentiate also the different fuel pathway and the origin of all these different alternative fuel. And it also takes into account some sustainability criteria in order only to support the fuel that are sustainable. So it's a kind of a technology neutral approach, because it's difficult at this stage basically to bid on the right for the future, but we believe there is a need at the policy side to provide the right instruments to kick in and prime pump this market that will need to be much more developed in the coming years if we want to achieve our targets.
I'll continue that before I give the floor to David, because we have a question from the audience specifically for Timothy. Is it true that the extension of the EU ETS to shippers outside the EU is the first example of extraterritorial application if aviation is slowly intra-EU? And if it is the first time, will this be a barrier to adoption or acceptance?
Aviation, I mean, we don't think it's an extraterritorial, basically, piece of legislation, because what we propose in terms of geographical scope is only to capture half, basically, of the emissions related to extra EU voyages, so that involve basically a port located outside the EU. And this is in line with discussions and options to share emissions among countries discussed, notably in the context of UNFCCC. So basically, it captures really the part of the emissions that is related to the EU economy, and that's in line with our objective of the Paris Agreement to basically reduce our emissions from an economy-wide perspective.
David Cummins, we have you back with us.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, we had some internet problems here. I guess my thoughts have been sort of tying in everything that's been said. When we formed the Blue Sky Maritime Coalition, it was basically to look at what are all the categories, if you will, of where the hurdles lie to getting to a decarbonized or net zero greenhouse gas emissions. And they were in technology, infrastructure, fuels, which we've been talking about. They were in policy and regulation and incentivizing first movers, de-risking, leveling the playing field of first movers. They were also in commercial constructs and financing, or they were just things we can be doing today. We think we can take 30 to 40% out of emissions just by operating differently. And in all those categories, we know how to do all those things. We mentioned that we know how to make different engines. We understand how to make fuels. We just don't know how to scale them yet. We understand how to do policy and regulation. The one thing that we don't know how to do, that this industry has never demonstrated an ability to do, is to collaborate. We work in a very stepwise, sequential, transactional fashion. So if we think about approving new fuels and dealing with the safety aspects and the toxicity aspects, or just the bunkering and the infrastructure aspects, coming all the way back to Håkan's original question, what are we going to do in the next 24 months? What we think we need to do is be very action-oriented, but we have to act in parallel, not sequentially. So when we design a pilot plant on a hydrogen vessel, it has to include pilot regulations and pilot policies that go with that, pilot commercial constructs and chartering agreements that are very different, that incentivize, environmental stewardship. We really have to work together and create. We won't get to a decarbonized world with basically just incremental improvements on today. We get there by thinking very big in a very different way, and then, starting small with pilots and demonstrations and scaling as fast as we can. So I think all of these are important questions, and there are questions around engines and questions around fuels, and there's questions around policies. But unless we pull together and approach those in a very, very collaborative, parallel way, we just don't think we're going to get there, and you'll end up in one of the other scenarios. And one final comment coming all the way back to Jeremy's, I don't think we just need alignment of policy in the different industry sectors and customers. We need collaboration. We need all those voices at the table to act very differently and pilot that and then scale it as fast as we can. And we don't need pioneers. We need a pioneer spirit. Pioneers tend to be individual. We've gathered 50 or so of those individuals in the US in our coalition. So class societies, engine manufacturers, policymakers, ship owners, port authorities, academia, service providers. But we've got to start taking action very quickly, and we have to act in a way that's collaborative. At least that's one view.
At this point, I want to thank everybody in the audience for all the questions. It's wonderful that you have sent in questions, but since we don't have that much time, we're going to move to our preset questions now that we have. Want to give the floor first to Martin Stopford, author and former president of Clarkson Research. Martin, are you with us, and do you have your question or comment ready?
Yeah, I guess I'm here, and I've been glued to the screen watching. I mean, what a lineup of heavyweights, as they say. Of course, mentally, not otherwise. I've got a quick couple of comments which lead to some questions. As always, I loved the Shell scenarios that Jeremy started with, and it did strike the wave scenario struck a note, because I remember in 2018, as Oftedal reminded us, IMO passed the regulation to cut greenhouse gases, and I believe that was a very hard fought decision. And my recollection then is no one paid that much attention to it, and what we've seen over the pandemic is really a deluge or a flood of new technology accompanied by a deluge of regulations. And I suspect that the wave technology, the sort of wave concept that Jeremy introduced, which is about human nature and the difficulties that human nature people have in cooperating, really reflect quite well with David Cummins's point just now about the need to cooperate and collaborate. And I think the question I'd like to ask the panel, I've got 3 points I sort of jotted down. And the first is that although we talk generically about regulations, I've just been trying to sort of write a paper about governance in shipping, and I came to the conclusion that really we have three levels of governance. We have the global governance, which is IMO, UN, and with the regional relationship. The EU's spoken very forcibly and very well about the use of market-based measures to actually push things through. But then we have the national level, and I think everybody knows how, I mean, it's a miracle to me in some ways that IMO ever gets anything through, because when you've got 100, I think it's 173 members, is that right? And to get everybody lined up, even in a time of crisis, is very difficult. And so the third level, though, and the level at which the work is actually done, is corporate governance. And this is the one that I don't hear mentioned very much. I think maybe David mentioned it in passing, but I mean, we have today 100,000 ships on the water. The average shipping company has 7 ships. The average bulk carrier company has about 14 ships. And if you ask around, probably the 14 ship company might have two people in the office, 3 people in the office tops for every ship at sea. And that is not a significant resource. And yet these companies, all 20,000 plus of them, are going to be confronted with stunningly difficult decisions. I mean, not just decisions about, do I order a ship like I did last time, but a little bit bigger, but decisions, and we've had 2 dress rehearsals for this, one with the water ballast and the other with the sulfur. I'm not going to go into them, but they're not very impressive in many ways in terms of the difficulties of getting people to do things. Most cases, people decided to sit on their hands and do as little as they possibly could. And forgive me if that seems a bit blunt, but that's, you know, I'm an economist and I'm pretty old now, so I can say what I like, you know. So that's my first point, is the corporate governance. The second, and I'd be very interested in what the people on the panel think about the size of car. I can see some of you nodding, some don't look so happy about it. And I would love to know what Mr. Bentham thinks about this from a Shell point of view, because, you know, they've really looked into this and have a very good, I mean, I've been following their scenarios since the 1970s and with great interest. The second point is, how do we approach it the right way? One of the things that McKinsey's written a number of very good studies about applying I4 technology on shore. And I think I4 technology goes hand in hand with decarbonisation. They're Siamese twins, because basically you need information to do almost anything we're going to do. We're going to have to redesign ship electrical systems. We're going to have to redesign control systems. If we're going to get the paperwork sorted out for the container industry, you have to coordinate the 40 or 50 different computer systems involved in shipping a container from the origin to the destination. And so these are very challenging things. And one of the things that McKinsey said in their surveys from experience on land is that they think that companies very often approach the problem of new technology in the wrong way. They start by looking at the technology and say, hey, we've got a fuel here, how do we apply it? Whereas they should, according to McKinsey, they should start by saying, we've got a problem here, what technology will help us to solve it? And I know certainly people like Formula One racing team and analysts use the latter, not the former, because they're very goal orientated. So that's a second issue, is, are we doing it the right way? And the third thing is, if the answer is not very good on the previous 2 questions, can the market measures, like sort of whacking great big taxes on bunker fuels or using the sort of systems that the market-based systems, can that actually produce a solution which these small companies in the shipping industry would be much more comfortable with? So that's 3 questions. I don't know whether anybody can get anything out of it. But we might start with these nice little companies out, and some very big ones.
Thank you very much, Martin. We're having such a great conversation that we're running a little bit out of time, but I saw that Jeremy had already raised a hand, so I would like to give the floor to Jeremy since Martin also referred to you, but go ahead, Jeremy.
Thanks, Anu, and thanks, Martin, for the questions. I won't be able to tackle all of them, but there's a point I want to make, and it really also refers exactly back to what David was saying, which I think links with your question as well, that sequentialism or incrementalism won't get there. So what that will invite is pressures building up, knee-jerk reactions, disorderly changes, and those are ultimately destroying of capital stock, destroying of economic productivity that's there. So you're wanting to actually get ahead of the curve and stay ahead of the curve. And that comes a little bit also to what I've seen in the corporate governance area. We have been actually talking about and understanding and exploring environmental pressures from the mid-80s in the scenarios you mentioned. And in my period, we have done a lot which has changed the direction of the company. And that was moving relatively well and relatively smoothly. But then society suddenly moved ahead of us in a particular arena. It was an arena that we were aware of and had highlighted in internal scenarios 3 or 4 years ago, but that was in the court arena. And people may well be aware of the court judgment in the Netherlands against Shell, which is ahead of our trajectory to do these changes. And so that's an example of how even with huge amount of attention, the company is moving, but now needs to accelerate because a particular area moved even faster than our fastest scenario. And so, yeah, that speaks into to what David was saying as well, that I think. An opinion on your other questions, I agree. One needs to start, if you like, from the almost the end user back, never mind the problem back, and not the technology forward. So that absolutely meets our perspective and experience as well. And market measures kind of work when technology possibilities are already in the zone of affordability. But they need to get into that zone of affordability. And that's where you need regulatory incentives and where you need those groups of pioneers that David spoke about to really align. Collaborate is better than just aligning, it's stronger, towards bringing the deployment of these new technologies into the mix that later market mechanisms can spread at greater scale. A few thoughts.
Thank you, Jeremy. We're about to run out of time. I have time, so I will stay, and I will still hopefully ask a few questions from the people who stay. For everybody who has to leave, we have posted on the chat the information for the call next week, and clearly there is plenty to continue the discussion with, so please join us then if you have to leave now. Meanwhile, I see Sveinung has raised a hand, so I would give you very brief comments on Martin, and then I would like to give the floor to our other Eero Håkanen. But yes.
Thank you very much. And as always, Martin has very important questions. Very short response. I think when it comes to what's happening now, it's not only about choosing your solution, it's also very important choosing your partner, because nobody can do it alone. Also, not doing it is becoming a less likely option and a more risky option. So therefore, when it comes to technology, fuel, finance, customers, everything is about who do you partner up with. I think that is also very important. When it comes to the national transition we are doing in Norway, because we also have domestic shipping, we have the green shipping program with bringing all partners together, and that is creating solutions. And I think that will happen to a larger extent also on the global scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Eero Håkanen, Ministerial Advisor, Ministry of Transport and Communications at the Finnish government. Eero, are you with us?
I'm here, Anu. Thank you so much for having me, and a huge thank you for the SEA20 for this panel for the excellent call today. Very excellent. I'm very happy and honored to address this distinguished members of the panel alongside Professor Stopford. Gosh, I'm really starstruck here. Now, if you allow me, just a quick description on where I come to this discussion from and how absolutely vital maritime transport is for Finland. Approximately 90% of Finnish exports and 80% of our imports are goods are carried by sea. So for a country located a long distance away from the main European markets and across a sea that freezes over in winter, may incur additional costs for reducing shipping emissions. So consequently, the challenge here lies really in finding an effective balance between measures that reduce emissions from ships and logistics on one hand, and their economic impacts on the industry and the economy on the other. So now, dear panel, my question is twofold, and please feel free to answer one or both of these questions. First, what do you consider as the main instrument to ensure a level playing field for countries like Finland with specific geographic circumstances while decarbonizing shipping both inside the EU and globally? And secondly, as a huge chunk of the investment needed to decarbonize shipping will be in land-based energy infrastructure, including the production and distribution of zero-emission fuels, what developments in industries outside shipping and the society in general are needed to make this transition happen in the schedule, very tight schedule needed? This is, of course, in relation to the overall energy transition already mentioned by Mr. Ofdal. These are my questions. Thank you.
Which of the panelists would like to tackle? You can raise a hand or just open your microphone. And of course, to our panelists as well, if you need to leave, we do not want to keep you beyond the time. If you have time to stay, please, we will wrap up in a moment.
So Anu, I can start briefly. The main instrument to ensure a level playing field is there isn't a holy grail or a silver bullet there. It's going to be different in different situations. But coming back to the previous questions on corporate governance too, corporate governance in public companies is dictated by a lot of pension funds, if you think about it in that way, or at least the way I simplistically think about it. And in private companies, it tends to be a mix of that and as well as just regulatory and the political environment as well that regulates that. But so again, I'm going to keep harping on the word collaboration. I may throw in the word flexibility there as well. You've got to rethink the whole way that companies, which are driven by profit models, think about that's where you have to have the level playing field. Right now, every commercial construct we have, a chartering contract between a cargo, mover and a ship owner operator, it's all there to make things economically risk shared or economically even. None of that is written right now to drive environmental stewardship. But it's a combination of everything that's, what governments invest in infrastructure in the land-based side, which you brought up as well, how financial institutions act, and it has to go way beyond the way just ESG is being done now to be very action specific. And it can't just be government programs that help with the upfront capex of doing things differently. It has to deal with the operating costs. Those are going to be very different depending on what type of vessel you're operating in what type of situation. So The only thing I would say, and again, in the U.S., we're focused on North America because some of the political headwinds tend to be very specific, as well as just the basis of the types of vessels we use. But in the U.S., because of the particular cabotage laws, which means all vessels that operate within the U.S. have to be U.S. owned, built in U.S. shipyards, U.S. operated with crews, those companies struggle to survive in any given situation. And so those vessels have to run for 45 to 50 years. So we're already way too late to do much, but a lot of it's just been renewed. But it just means that we are focusing very heavily on retrofit types of things and fuel flexibility. These companies can't guess wrong about what type of fuel, or can't invest because a couple of stranded assets and they're bankrupt. So it again has to be everything coming together and thinking this holistically. And I don't like the term well to wake, because very soon we're not going to be using wells anymore, or as much as possible. And it has to go way beyond the wake too, because you have to deal with the shore side, the end consumers. You have to deal with these other industries. So cradle to grave, end to end, pick your thing. But well to wake, I think, is one thing that's going to go away as well. Sorry, that's enough for me.
I see Janotto has a hand raised, but I want to check and see if Alexis Rodriguez is with us. Alexis works as environmental protection specialist at Panama Canal. Alexis, are you here? Alexis sent a question for me in advance. But if we don't have you on the line anymore, then I will just go ahead and give Jan-Otto and Andrea Morgante a turn to speak, and please just briefly, because we will end soon, even though this is fascinating. Okay, Jan-Otto, go ahead.
Yeah. It's a cradle-to-cradle answer here. Absolutely, it's very important to look at the complete, supply chain. That's the reason I go back to this issue of collaboration in answer to the second question on the availability of the fuels. What is needed really is a collaboration between those who actually can develop the fuels, who have the, overview of the transportation, the infrastructure, then the ships and the end consumers as well. And therefore, I mentioned the Maersk Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. That's an example, at least also, where you have all of these players covering oil companies, ship owners, technology providers, engine manufacturers, and so on. And we see quite a number of projects already now where we see a strong interest in the development of green hydrogen, green methanol, green ammonia using renewables, whether it's wind, solar, whatever is available. And then, of course, it's important for those who invest in this that you have already some certainty. Okay, if I'm a ship owner, I would like to know where can I bunker the fuel and when. Is the technology there to do this? And of course, those who provide the fuel have some certainty of, yes, there will be some takers, that uptake of that fuel and when it's a new fuel. So I think in that sense, really, the first movers, again, it's very important to have the first movers. And hopefully with that knowledge, you can build up the experience that it will be hopefully then disseminated to all these many ship owners we have indeed, with thousands of ship owners who have less than 10 ships each, and they need to have, let's say, a different way to be able to, let's say, get an advantage or at least benefit, from what is being tested and then tried out, and then without having the ability themselves, to invest in such technologies. So thanks.
Thank you. And final word to Andrea Morgante. I think Andrea just muted still.
Yeah, actually, Jan-Otto already said it. And as actually, what I was thinking is really there are very good examples right now of these kind of ecosystems that show the way. I mean, where you connect. I think that we, as an industry, we cannot think we will solve this within the industry. The industry is not able to, I think, to generate the amount of both the volume and the frequency required to de-risk investments in production plants. So you need to team up with off-takers from other industries, and the land and sea really need to work at unison here. The best examples we are part of, at least the projects are moving forward faster, captive projects where you have this kind of closed loop, where you have all the key stakeholders in that project, covering all the aspects of it.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you so much for our fantastic speakers and panelists today. Thank you to our audience for sending in so many questions and for staying with us. It's a fantastic conversation, you know, when everybody doesn't disappear when the clock ticks. But my apologies for us running a little bit over time. Thank you everyone so much, and I really hope that everybody can join next week as we continue the conversation with different panel, and especially from the point of view of markets and finance and how those can accelerate decarbonization. And the details for that are in the chat window, and of course you can use the same link that you used today to join that call a week from now. Thank you everyone. We will conclude the event today.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.